welcome to our panel. Welcome to the conference. I'm Louise Freeman, a retired professor of psychology from Mary Baldwin University. Very excited to be here, very excited to have this panel. Which is called The Mirror of Rettopyrrah, Wizarding World Reflections in Post-Potter Books. So hard as might be to believe, J.K. Rowling's post-Harry Potter books have for several years outnumbered her Potter books. They are Casual Vacancy, a standalone novel that was published in 2012, the Cormoran Strike series, which began in 2013, is now up to 8 volumes, and the most recent came out about 6 weeks ago. Both of these books are for adults. And then her post-Potter children's works are the Ickabog, which was originally published in 2020, actually released online for free during the pandemic, subsequently then printed in book form, and then The Christmas Pig, which came out in 2021. So only a subset of Harry Potter readers have gone on to read any of these books. Part of that in recent years has been due to the controversy surrounding the author, but that was true even before that began. However, those of us who have often found definite themes, imagery, other aspects of the books that remind us of Harry Potter. Now, the beauty of a mirror is that it can both reflect and invert. So sometimes we see things that seem very analogous to Harry Potter. Sometimes we see things that are in complete contrast. So for this panel today, interestingly enough, all 3 speakers tended to focus on the bad guys or the villains. So there are really 3 types of villains in Harry Potter. I call the absolute villain, the kind of irredeemably bad people who really exist to give us satisfaction when they are defeated by a good character. For example, we all cheer when Molly Weasley takes down Bellatrix Lestrange. Then there's the false villain, the enemy that is initially maybe portrayed as a bad guy or a bad person, but turns out actually to not be evil, perhaps sometimes to even be the one who was wronged in some way. And we have Sirius Black as an example of that. And then finally, we have the redeemed villain, someone who maybe has a history of evil, but has expressed regret, has shown through actions that they have reformed, and are therefore considered redeemed. And of course, we have Snape as an example of that. I think the false villains and the redeemed villains are very important for the development of perspective taking and empathy, which we know is a trait of fiction in general and has been specifically shown for the Harry Potter books. So this panel will focus on, we'll have 3 talks. We're going to do them back to back and then have discussion at the end. Mine will be first, where I'll be looking at 2 good versus evil showdowns, one from Harry Potter and one from Troubled Blood, one of the Cormoran Strike books. Then we'll have Lana Whited speaking about the Ickabog and the title character of that, who interestingly is a monster, or at least initially depicted as a monster, but one who is gender fluid, which is certainly an interesting thing to see in a Rowling book. And then finally, Katie McDaniel will also do a villain comparison. She'll look at villains from both Harry Potter and The Christmas Pig, who blur the distinction between people and objects. So what I hope here is even folks who maybe have not read all of these books yet will enjoy these talks and see some reflections of what we liked about Harry Potter. My contribution to today's panel is A Serial Killer's Rebounding Spell, a Deathly Hallows echo in Troubled Blood. I'm Louise Freeman, a professor of psychology retired from Mary Baldwin University. Before we begin, I want to remind everyone that the Cormoran Strike series is a series written for adults. I will be reading parts of it as part of the presentation, so I want to put in a language warning in case there are parents or teachers in the audience with underage wizards. We should expect the Cormoran Strike series to have mirror echoes to Harry Potter. The idea that the Cormoran Strike series is a parallel series to Harry Potter has been around for some time, really since the second book was published in 2014. Robert Galbraith was outed as a pseudonym for J.K. Rowling shortly before this book was published, and when it appeared, turned out the mystery centered on a dark and disturbing autobiographical book that is wreaking havoc in the publishing community of London. So very reminiscent of what happened in The Chamber of Secrets with Tom Riddle's diary. Interestingly, both covers have a bit of red color scheme there. So I was quite skeptical of this idea when it first appeared. There was a lot of talk about it on the HogwartsProfessor.com site, but I wasn't quite sure I bought these arguments. But I wrote a blog post in 2014 saying, all right, if this is indeed a parallel series, what would make the most sense is for the fourth book to be set at the time of the London Olympics in 2012. Now, the first two were set in 2010, so this would mean picking up the pace a bit. As it turned out, book 3 was set in 2011 and ended on a cliffhanger in July of that year. We had to wait until 2018 for the fourth book in the series, Lethal White, to come out. It did pick up immediately after to resolve the cliffhanger, but then it jumped a full year ahead. So landing us in July 2012, right at the time of the London Olympics. And interesting, these covers also have a similar color scheme. But not only that, the murder victim in Lethal White was a government minister with some responsibility for the success of the games. He was killed by his son, who he recently had helped get out of prison. There's also a suspicious minister for sport. There is a formal Yule Ball style event that the detectives attend as part of the investigation. Many, many other parallels to Goblet of Fire. So the idea that Cormoran Strike series would strongly parallel the Harry Potter series was really cemented with this fourth book. What I'm talking about today, however, is the fifth book, Troubled Blood. It was published in September of 2020. It was set in the fall of 2013 through the fall of 2014 over the course of a year. And Cormoran Strike and Robin Ellicott are hired to solve the cold case of Margot Bamborough, a doctor, wife, and mother who disappeared in 1974. The leading hypothesis is that Margot was killed by a serial killer named Dennis Creed, who is known to have abducted, tortured, and murdered 7 other women. He's strongly suspected of killing 3 others, including Margot, but has never confessed to those killings, and he uses any interviews or any other publicity he gets as a means to taunt these families, hinting that he has killed them, but refusing to admit to it, and the bodies have never been found. So Creed was originally tried and jailed in 1976. He pled insanity, but was found to be sane and sent to jail. However, by the time of Troubled Blood, he is in Broadmoor Psychiatric Hospital and has been there for many years. His mental health has deteriorated over the decades, and he is now judged to be criminally insane. So during the investigation, the detectives meet the father of Louise Tucker, a 16-year-old schoolgirl, one of the other three whom Creed is also suspected of killing. Brian Tucker has spent 40 years trying to prove that Creed killed his daughter and researching Creed's life to try to figure out where he might have buried her. So the Bamborough and the Tucker families together petitioned the Justice Department to allow Strike into the hospital to interview Creed. So this interview, which is really more of a showdown between Strike and Creed in Broadmoor, has a very similar structure and tone to Harry's final duel with Voldemort in Deathly Hallows. Both encounters are one-on-one battles of words and will between a protagonist and an irredeemably evil psychopath. They're witnessed by others who don't interfere. Harry, of course, the encounter takes place in the Great Hall with the community all watching. Creed, it's in a conference room in the hospital with 2 doctors and a nurse observing, but not interfering. The protagonist, in each case, has knowledge that the psychopath does not know, and that knowledge is the weapon that causes the psychopath to have one of his own tricks turned against him. So Dennis Creed, I would say, is probably the closest character to a Voldemort that you're ever going to see in a realistic novel. He's kind of a cross between Ted Bundy and Hannibal Lecter. In fact, if you listen to the audiobook, the narrator, Robert Glenister, gives him a voice that's very reminiscent of Anthony Hopkins in the Silence of the Lambs movie. But they were both conceived under coercive conditions. Merope Gaunt used a love potion. Creed was the product of rape by his mother's stepfather. Both were abandoned to terrible childhoods. Creed's mother actually left Dennis with these same abusive grandparents who allowed the rape, basically. Voldemort, of course, was left in the orphanage. They're both highly intelligent. Voldemort was an excellent student and a prefect at Hogwarts. Creed has an IQ of 140 plus. They both have unusual and scary eyes. Voldemort's, of course, are the red snake-like eyes. Creed has irises of such pale gray that they faded into the sclera, so that the enormous pupils seem surrounded by whiteness. And they are both psychopaths. Creed is described by his psychiatrist as a classic sociopath, a pure example of the type. He scores very highly on the dark triad: narcissism, Machiavellianism, and psychopathy. He's devious, sadistic, unrepentant, and extremely egotistical. And of course, that describes Voldemort pretty well as well. You can find any number of scholarly papers written about Voldemort and about what a fine example of a literary psychopath he is. Neither has any true friends, only relationships with people that are somehow useful to them, and both are kidnappers, torturers, and murderers. What do the bad guys want from these encounters? Well, for Voldemort, he wants to be recognized as the world's most powerful wizard. He wants to live forever, and therefore he believes he has to kill Harry. This is, of course, because of the famous prophecy. I'm not going to read the whole thing. I'm going to assume everyone is familiar with it, but I will highlight one part. But he will have the power the Dark Lord knows not. So let's keep that in mind as we go forward. Creed wants attention and publicity. He also wants a transfer back to Belmarsh prison. Like a lot of criminals who are judged insane and sent to psychiatric hospitals, he's figured out he actually had more freedom in prison, and he wants to go back, and he wants Strike to help put pressure on the authorities to transfer him back. And he needs to believe he is the winner in any encounter. Creed needed to believe he hadn't given Strike what he had really wanted. He had to come out on top. So his first question to Strike is whether Strike is there for Margot Bamborough or Louise Tucker. Well, Strike answers quite truthfully that he was hired by Margot's daughter. Here is one example where Strike has a power or a piece of information that Creed knows not. It does not occur to Creed that the two families could be collaborating. And this is the kind of the blind spot of the psychopath, this inability to understand altruism, cooperation, friendship, the idea that two families could be assisting each other just really isn't in his vocabulary. So what power do the good guys have? Well, Harry knows he can bait Voldemort into using Avada Kedavra, and he also knows he's the master of the Elder Wand and that it will not kill him. We remember during their conversation, during the duel, Voldemort says, "You must believe that you have magic that I do not, or else a weapon more powerful than mine." And Harry simply responds, "I believe both." Now for Strike, he's a very skilled interrogator, so he's very hopeful that he can bait Creed into giving up some of his secrets. He also knows what really happened to Margot Bamborough, and this will be quite important. So Creed, in the course of this interview, brags to Strike about the way he lures women into his basement flat, which is really more of a torture chamber. He would chat them up in bars and usually try to slip them some sort of drug. But mainly he would try to gain their trust. So I say, "Well, I've got to go, sweetheart. You be careful." "Be careful." It always worked. "Oh, don't go. Have a drink." "No, darling, I need my beauty sleep." That's when you prove you're not a threat. You make as if you want to leave or actually walk away. Then, when they call you back, they're relieved because you're the nice man who's safe. So Creed then tries to trade his confession for a transfer. "I want to go back to Belmarsh, Cormoran. I'm sane. You know it too. You just said it. It's costing the taxpayer 5 times as much to keep me here as it would in jail. Where would the British public say I should be, eh?" "Oh, they'd want you back in prison." "Well, I agree with them. I agree. I'm sane, and if I'm treated like it, I'll act like it. I killed Louise Tucker." Now, the observing doctors are quite stunned by this admission. Creed has not admitted this in 40 years. Creed goes on to give very lurid details of the crime and how he found and killed this young girl. Strike asks, "What did you do with the body?" I think I'm going to need a transfer back to Belmarsh before I tell anyone that. You go tell the newspapers I've decided to confess to killing Louise, and that I'm sane, and that I should be in Belmarsh. And if I'm transferred, I'll tell old Brian Tucker where I put his little girl." "You never know. I might even feel up to talking about Margot Bamborough when I'm out of here." So Strike got to his feet looking angry. "You're full of shit. I'm not passing this on." "Don't be like that because it's not the one you came for. You're coming across like a proper narcissist, Cormoran." A bit of projection there. Strike says to the doctors, "I'm ready to go." "Don't be like that. Oi!" Strike turned back. "All right, I'll give you a little clue about where I put Louise's body, and we'll see if you're as clever as you think you are." So notice that Strike made Creed call him back. Strike could tell that Creed was imagining weeks of front pages as he laid a trail for the investigators to follow. Psychological torture for the Tuckers, manipulation of public opinion, Strike perhaps at his beck and call. It was a sadist's wet dream. Go on then, what's the clue? You'll find Louise Tucker's body where you find M54. Strike knew Creed had thought out the clue well ahead of time, and was certain it would have been a clue about Margot Bamborough had Strike said he'd been hired by the Tuckers. Right, shall we? M54, all right, Cormoran? I heard you. Sorry not to be able to help with Dr. Bamborough. Strike could hear his pleasure at the idea that he'd thwarted the detective. So Creed thinks he's won here. Now on to the rebounding spell moments. For Harry and Voldemort. Again, I'm going to assume people are familiar with this one. Voldemort shouts Avada Kedavra. Harry counters with Expelliarmus. But I am going to remind you how this played out in the book. Harry saw Voldemort's green jet meet his own spell, saw the Elder Wand fly high, spinning through the air towards the master it would not kill, who had come to take full possession of it at last. And Harry, with the unerring skill of the Seeker, caught the wand in his free hand, and Voldemort fell backward, arms splayed, the slit pupils of the scarlet eyes rolling upward. Tom Riddle hit the floor with a mundane finality, his body feeble and shrunken, the white hands empty, the snake-like face vacant and unknowing. Voldemort was dead, killed by his own rebounding curse. Please note that this is a little different than Voldemort dissolving into a cloud of confetti and floating away. So a quick note to the TV series makers to please do this scene correctly in the TV series. So for Strike and Creed, what do we see? Remind you where we left off. Sorry not to be able to help with Dr. Bamborough. Strike turned back one last time, and now he stopped pretending to be angry and grinned. I was here for Louise, you silly fucker. I know you never met Margot Bamborough. She was murdered by a far more skillful killer than you ever were. And just so you know, the nurse's keys jangled. Little reminder that Creed's not going anywhere. And Creed's slack, fat face registered dismay. I think you're a fucking lunatic. And if anyone asks me, I'll say you should be in Broadmoor till you rot. So Creed is fully defeated in this duel with Strike because he gets absolutely nothing that he wanted. The clue is easily solved with a bit of Googling combined with the information that Brian Tucker has gathered. Louise Tucker's body is very quickly found. Brian Tucker is able to get closure, bury his daughter, and know that all of his research finally paid off. Creed's power over the families and the media is broken. He's no longer going to be able to torment them. Creed was manipulated into giving the clue when he called Strike back, just like he had manipulated the women he met into calling him back. He did not get Strike's help in getting transferred, and he was told there was a more skillful murderer out there than him who actually killed Margot Bamborough. And there's really no better way to insult a serial killer than to tell them there's a better serial killer than you out there. This also reminds us of what Harry said during the duel, that Dumbledore was cleverer than you, a better wizard, a better man. In the epilogue, in describing the publicity after these cases are resolved, it says that Dennis Creed, who for so long had received top billing in any news story involving him, was relegated to almost a footnote in this one. The real killer of Margot Bamborough had outdone him, not only in number of suspected victims, but in remaining undetected for decades longer. So both Creed and Voldemort were destroyed, I would argue, by their own rebounding spells. and both are left with vacant or slack faces in the aftermath of their defeat. So, in conclusion, although Harry Potter and Cormoran's Strike are very different characters in very different book series, both defeat unrepentant psychopaths with a rebounding spell strategy. The scenes are in many ways mirror images of each other, and because of this, they both evoke very positive emotions for the readers as they vicariously experience this unequivocal triumph of good over evil. So thank you for your attention. We'll have discussion after the other two presentations. If you are interested in more of my work on Cormoran's Strike or Harry Potter or multiple other series, please check out my blog it's called the Farting Sofa Faculty Lounge. Thank you, and we'll see what the next speakers have to say. Thank you for your attention to that one. We'll go ahead and move on to the next talk as quickly as possible, and that is Dr. Lana Whitehead talking about the Ickabog as concordance for the Rowling Catastrophe.
Good morning, everyone. I had an interesting development in the last week in working on this presentation, and I really had planned to talk about some correspondences that interest me between the way the theme of prejudice is handled in the Harry Potter series and the way that theme is handled in Rowling's 2020 book-length fairy tale, The Ickabog. And I was all set to record my presentation about that last week when I developed an upper respiratory infection and I lost my voice. And during that period, when I was unable to record the presentation, I started to think about the way that Louise has defined the theme for this session and realized that I wasn't really addressing the mirroring aspect quite as much as I would perhaps like to. When it occurred to me that in these two works, there are significant songs which really relate to identity and history, which are really important in tying in with that theme. It occurred to me specifically that the Sorting Hat is used to present us with, when we get it in Harry Potter and the Order of the Phoenix, the history of Hogwarts and the story of the founders of Hogwarts and their eventual split, and that the Ickabog, when Daisy Dovetail, our heroine in the Ickabog, finally meets the actual creature in person, conveys its story and the story of its race in the form of a song. That seemed a very interesting correspondence to me. And the more I thought about it, the more I saw interesting parallels that I want to talk about today. And I promise to come back to, I am going to be talking about villains, and Louise has really helped with the introduction this morning, because I will mention the absolute villain of the Ickabog series, Lord Spittleworth, who is a government minister in a situation with a very ineffectual king who's kind of preoccupied himself with his own love of wardrobe, very much like the Emperor in The Emperor's New Clothes by Hans Christian Andersen, and kind of stepped away from paying very much attention to his government. Spittleworth is an absolute villain. Everything that Louise has said this morning about Voldemort, I would say, applies to him. He is a character who would have exactly the same response if he were to be asked to try for some remorse, as Harry asks Voldemort in the conclusion of the Harry Potter series. Instead, I'm going to focus mostly on the false villain of the Ickabog, and that is the creature itself, who is very much misjudged, an other, and who is the author of this song that I want to compare in some ways to the Song of the Sorting Hat in the Harry Potter series. I do not assume that most folks have read the Ickabog, because I find that that generally is not the case. I know that there are some people in our panel this morning who have read it, but I'm just going to give a little bit of background. The Ickabog was published in 2020. On May 28th of that year, Rowling announced that she would be publishing this work in installments between June 2nd and July 10th. and it was initially serialized on her website. That project included an illustration contest for children to submit illustrations, some of which did eventually end up in the published book, which came out actually in the next year. You'll be seeing a few of those illustrations in the presentation today. I wish I could have included more of them because they're wonderful. And if I could have drawn as well as any of those children when I was a small person, I would have been very happy. The Ickabog is a political allegory. It's a fable that is essentially about prejudice and the way that this government minister is using this creature, which is said to be man-eating, to eat people's livestock. And so that prejudice is used by the government as a way of enforcing control. There is an Ickabog tax that all of the people have to pay. It causes a lot of hardship in the kingdom. And the purpose of the tax is supposedly to fund this Ickabog Defense Brigade, which is supposed to keep everybody safe from this creature. In the last few years, most of my research about work by Rowling has focused on the Ickabog, and I have written a couple of book chapters, one for the Ivory Tower, Harry Potter, and beyond, about the tradition of beasts and creatures in fantasy literature, and offering a kind of an amateur psychoanalytic explanation for the function of beasts and the fear of beasts in stories for children. More recently, I have written a chapter for a volume that's forthcoming about the Ickabog as a gender fluid creature, which is, as Louise said, really interesting in the context of the controversy involving Rowling and the way that her reputation imploded right at the same time that this book, The Ickabog, was being released in installments. Most of those really problematic and explosive tweets were being posted right during the same period when the installments of this book were being released every day. And the book, as I said before, does deal with themes of prejudice and propaganda, which is one of the themes that I've done a fair amount of work on in the context of the Harry Potter series. So those are all very important as background to my comparison of these two songs. Okay, so I'm going to talk about mirroring songs of identity and history. The Song of the Hogwarts Sorting Hat, and not the original, but the new one that the Sorting Hat sings in year 5 of the series, and the song that the Ickabog sings very late in the Ickabog, about 3/4 of the way through, when Daisy Dovetail and her 3 friends finally show up in the marshlands at the far northern part of the kingdom, where they've gone to actually see this creature for themselves. So that's the contrast that I'm interested in. Okay. First of all, I want to talk about the way that the tone of the song begins and then changes from the start to the end, the way that it sort of moves in terms of emotional concepts in the song. So at the very beginning, the song is very much about hope and unity, starts with this idea of a sort of wonderful past where things were wonderful. The 4 good friends, as the first few lines, the first, I would say, stanza, because both of these songs are really written in a ballad kind of form, talk about, the wonderful partnership of these very good friends, and how they were so close that it's difficult to say whether Slytherin and Gryffindor were closer than Hufflepuff and Ravenclaw. In the Ickabog song, the first stanza addresses the dawn of time, when only Ickabogs existed, no other creatures. Man was not created. And of course, when man comes along, the problems begin to develop in the story. So the first stanza says, the world in its perfection was like heaven's bright reflection. So everything was perfect at the beginning of this song. The stanzas of the song have a refrain, and that refrain changes. And I want to ask you to pay attention to the way the refrain changes. At the end of the first stanza, the refrain is, "Oh, Ickabogs, come bounding back." Bounding is the word that is used for the concept of giving birth with Ickabogs. So pay attention to the way that that refrain changes. This one is, "Come bounding back." In other words, repeat this idea of heaven's bright reflection. And the illustration is from the part of the book where the Ickabog finally sings that song for Daisy Dovetail. Her three friends are still kind of in the background. They're still really wary of this creature whom they presume probably plans to eat them at some point. So they're a little reluctant at this point. But Daisy is forming a relationship of allyship with the creature, which is very important in the overall theme. So then in each song, a kind of fault line appears. And these descriptions, by the way, at the top of the stanza are mine. They are not actually from the songs. I'm just kind of trying to track the way that the tone changes. So in the next stanza, things begin to go wrong. It turns out with the founders of Hogwarts, and I know you don't need a review of this, that they actually disagree about what students should be invited to come to the school. And that is really the first sign of any sort of discord in their relationship. And eventually, then, of course, Slytherin leaves because they can't reach agreement. The same kind of thing transpires in the Ickabog's song when bitterness is introduced. The concept of bitterness, which is described as having a rough voice and mean ways, something the Ickabogs had not previously experienced at all. Notice in this refrain of the song, Ickabogs are advised to be bornded wise. After that, conflict ensues. As the discord becomes worse, feeding on our faults and fears, the Sorting Hat song says, this is a new song, and the Sorting Hat explains it has concern about discord within the school that might make it vulnerable to enemies outside the school. It becomes a song of warning, almost a sort of prophecy, if you will. And this is the point at which Slytherin departs. In the Song of the Ickabog, this particular point happens when the race of man comes into being, and man almost immediately victimizes the Ickabog. The song says, armies were raised to smite the Ickabogs. In hundreds, Ickabogs were slain. Our blood poured on the land like rain. Our ancestors, the trees, were felled, and still men came to fight us. In this particular refrain, the word at the end of line 1 and line 3 changes to brave. Oh, Ickabogs, be bornded brave. Be bornded brave, my Ickabogs. So again, a kind of warning that things are about to get worse, that courage is going to be needed. Then it becomes clear that danger is looming. And this is the part of the Sorting Hat song when the song explains that it's changing its song. This year, I'll go further. It says, my purpose is to sort you, but this year I'm going to go further to give you this warning. I really have a sense that the concept of sorting itself is wrong. And that really underscores this idea of prejudice as a way of separating certain individuals, others, or groups into categories based on prejudices, based on preconceptions, based in the story of the Ickabog about rumor, in the minds of people who are uninformed, who don't have any firsthand experience with that creature. And in the Song of the Ickabog, in the last part, the Ickabog actually describes how Ickabogs were removed actually from their home. And this is when they are marginalized, sent to live in the marshlands at the north of the kingdom. And in this refrain, it changes substantially, not just one word, but, oh, Ickabogs, now kill the men, now kill the men, my Ickabog. So it's come to conflict at this point, at the end of the song. Okay. Now I want to point out some specific echoes of sorting in the Ickabog song. First of all, I noticed as I thought about those, the way that the refrain of each stanza changes there, it sort of echoes the Hogwarts houses. Be born did wise might be a way of saying be Ravenclaws. Be born did kind, which is in a verse that I actually skipped on the slides. It was quite early in the part about the time when things were good for Ickabogs. Might be a way of saying be Hufflepuffs. Once we reach the point that a fault line begins to appear, be born did brave in the refrain might be a way of saying be Gryffindors. And finally, and I think this is not maybe as neat a parallel, but when ambition comes into the picture and man becomes a threat to the Ickabog, I think that's a little more like saying be Slytherins. So I think there is a sense in which those houses are echoed in the virtues that pop up in the Sorting Hat song. There are obviously 4 Hogwarts houses. There are 4 children who are seeking the Ickabog. Daisy Dovetail and her good friend Bert Beamish, who've known each other from childhood, who've grown up together in Cornucopia. Roderick Roach, who also has grown up in Cornucopia, but who has been something of a Draco Malfoy figure as a child to Daisy and Bert, and then subsequently is won over when he learns more, is won over when he learns some of the things that they know about what's really going on in the kingdom. In both of these works, and again, when I talk about Harry Potter, I'm focusing primarily on Order of the Phoenix. There is the threat of a corrupt government, which uses propaganda and rules to maintain control. Think about all the decrees that are posted on the wall in Hogwarts that the students have to follow. There's similar kinds of decrees established by the government of Cornucopia, whose purpose is supposedly to keep people safe from the threat of the Ickabog. In both cases, fear tactics and dog whistles are used to enhance a fear that is essentially baseless. As I said, baseless early on. The Ickabog really is presented as the villain in this kingdom when, quite frankly, Ickabogs turn out to be a false victim, a sort of dog whistle. It will not surprise you to know that at the point that Rowling published this work, she specifically said in interviews that she had Boris Johnson and Donald Trump in mind. And it's interesting to me now, looking back on this story again, to think about not only how relevant that seemed when the book was published in 2020, but how relevant it seems, more relevant in some ways, 5 years later. In both these cases, we have an imposter who represents the government and is supposed to endorse that very strong authoritarian control. Obviously, in Order of the Phoenix, it's Umbridge. It's Lord Spittleworth in the Ickabog, this minister whose very name suggests that he's not really worth a spit, sort of conveys this warning about him. And in both cases, these are songs which are sung warnings of external danger to a population that has been weakened by internal conflict. And because of that internal conflict, because of that division, in Cornucopia, for example, there are the government and the people who are frightened by the warnings the government is making. And there also is a resistance, which involves Daisy Dovetail's mother, Bert Beamish's mother, Daisy Dovetail's father, and it involves a number of other people who've been thrown into prison because they see through what's going on in their government. This resistance group that is formed to fight the government reminds me very much of Dumbledore's army, a group of essentially resistance fighters composed of teenagers, basically, who are more idealistic and in some ways more skeptical than the older citizens. In both cases, we have a marginalized other who finds allies in teenagers, primarily because those teenagers don't simply listen to the rumors about the Ickabog. They actually travel to the marshlands, which is a very exhausting and dangerous journey, and turns out to be happening during winter toward the end of that experience. They rely on empirical evidence and their own encounter with the creature. And all of this happens because of the fourth of these children, who has grown up in the marshlands. Every time one of the other child characters questions whether the Ickabog is actually real or not, because people don't know, this young girl, Martha, always says, there is an Ickabog, you know. And so there's a kind of a reality principle that these teenagers are driven toward, seeing with their own eyes what's going on when they actually get there. Both stories condemn a corrupt government and endorse the idea of resistance efforts and experiencing, particularly encounters with other people yourself, rather than taking other people's word for what is true. Both warn about the divisive effects of propaganda and rumor, and the dangers of being self-absorbed, like King Fred the Fearless, who, as I said before, primarily preoccupies himself with his wardrobe and his pastries all day long. The dangers of complacency, which is really what Fred is doing wrong. He's not a bad man. He's really, in some ways, a kind man. He's simply not paying attention to what these increasingly powerful advisors are doing. And it also warns about the importance of having good critical thinking skills. Finally, and I think this is a really important point, it endorses the concept of rehabilitation. In the end of the story, when Daisy and her friends finally return to Cornucopia with this very frightened Ickabog, which, by the way, is just about to give birth, with the nature of those offspring being determined by whether the birth is a happy birth or an unhappy birth. When they finally return, there is a confrontation. It turns out that there is an offspring of both kinds, a happy Ickabogle, as they're called, and a violent Ickabogle. And King Fred, out of his real repentance about not having paid attention to what is going on in his kingdom, is really grief-stricken. He is able to show some remorse. You know, he can reach the point that Harry asks Voldemort to try for. And after this, there is a complete transition. And as we're told in the end of all fairy tales, they lived happily ever after because they form a democratic government. They put a fellow named Gordon Goodfellow in the position of leadership. They punish Spittleworth by sending him to prison and letting all the resistance fighters out of prison. They build a museum to preserve the lessons of the past so that they will remember what happened and not repeat those mistakes in the future. They learn a lot more about Ickabogs generally. Daisy Dovetail becomes a leading expert about Ickabogs and Ickabog culture. And they provide lifetime care for this bad-borned Ickabogle, whose suffering essentially was caused by the bigoting of the people and the violence that transpires during the time it's being born. And they provide the king, Fred, an opportunity to reform, an opportunity to transform himself by caring for, being the primary caretaker for this Ickabogle, which has come into the world in an experience of conflict because of the fear of the citizens of Cornucopia. This fairy tale is essentially a lesson about not judging what you have not experienced for yourself. It's a lesson about the dangers of prejudice and the extent to which persecution based on prejudice can go. And it's ultimately a story about the possibility of rehabilitation and remorse, which raises the question, if a reader of this little book can understand that message and can connect it with the way the theme of prejudice and persecution is treated in the Harry Potter series, why the hell can't the author get that point? That's the aspect of this that is most interesting to me. The book ends with these words: whether people were really bornded from Ickabogs, I cannot tell you. Perhaps we go through a bornding when we change, for better or for worse. All I know is that countries like Ickabogs can be made gentle by kindness, which is why the kingdom of cornucopia lived happily ever after. And that, friends, is an apt lesson for the kingdom of cornucopia, for the world of Hogwarts, or frankly, for any time and place. Thank you for listening.
That was absolutely great, and looking forward to discussion later on. We will go ahead and move on to Katie's talk as quickly as possible, which is titled Consuming Death, Voldemort versus the Loser.
Hi, everybody. I think that you will see some really interesting parallels in what we're doing, and especially this idea of redemption and so on. I think that, so stay tuned maybe for that. Okay. So my paper is Consuming Death, Voldemort versus the Loser, and I'm really just going to compare these two, put these two in front of each other as they are mirroring each other, and explore some of the ideas. And so my focus is the novel The Christmas Pig from 2021, and how its main villain, the loser, mirrors Lord Voldemort, especially as they embody responses to and metaphors for both consumption and death, and how death itself can consume and become consuming. Ultimately, both are meditations on grief, how grief feels and how we cope with it, eating and turning to material hoarding to fill the void. I'm going to assume you're more likely to be quite familiar with Lord Voldemort, so I'm like my panelists in sort of assuming knowledge of Harry Potter. But I think you might be less familiar with the villain of the less famous standalone novel, The Christmas Pig. And so I'm going to share quite a lot of that novel with you. I think it's definitely worth reading. And hopefully, if you haven't read it, this will prime your interest. So let's take a look at the loser. In The Christmas Pig, the boy Jack has lost his beloved stuffed animal, a well-worn Beanie Baby-like pig named Derpig, or DP, who has been Jack's closest confidant through his parents' divorce, a move to a different town and a new school, and his mother's remarriage. On Christmas Eve, Jack's new teenage stepsister, Holly, throws DP out a car window while the car speeds down a motorway. She does so after Jack, normally kind, quiet, and meek, finally snaps back at her persistent bullying, calling her a loser and putting the sign of the L on his forehead. Then, so fast that he had no hope of stopping her, Holly leaned forward, seized DP out of Jack's lap, and threw him out of the open window. For a brief second, Jack saw DP frozen against the steely sky, his little trotters spread-eagled. Then he was whipped away, out of sight. Lost. Jack becomes crazed with grief, screaming and throwing things around his room, including his toys, when a tearful Holly brings him a replacement pig, a brand new look-alike of DP. Jack stomps on him and tries to pull his head off. Nevertheless, late that night, Jack awakens to the toys in his room, including the new Christmas pig, or CP, talking about a way Jack could maybe get DP back. DP, CP, and the other talking toys have been enlivened by being loved by people and thus have a kind of sentience. Jack could, on this one magical night in the last hours of Christmas Eve, journey to the land of the lost, find DP, and bring him back. Soon, CP leads a miniature toy-sized Jack to a spot in the house where they can be lost themselves, and they descend into this other realm. But this is a realm of the lost, not only lost things, but lost feelings, habits, and ideas. When Jack and CP find themselves in a long bureaucratic line to be sorted by status, mislaid, disposable, surplus, valuable, and so on, they learn that this realm is governed by an evil tyrant called the Loser. He makes and enforces all the rules in the land of the lost and, quote, he cheats. Jack and CP see a panicky toy labeled surplus named Blue Bunny being shoved into a dark hole where he'll be deposited in the wastes of the unlamented, an inhospitable frozen tundra in which he will almost certainly be eaten by the Loser. Recognize already the elements of this story that mirror the hero's journey pattern of the Harry Potter books. A boy who has known loss enters a magical but dangerous realm where, assisted by friends, he seeks to defeat evil authoritarian forces. That evil authoritarian force in the Christmas Pig is called the Loser. Like He Who Must Not Be Named, the Loser is not present for most of the novel, but is rather a persistent, terrifying rumor spoken about in hushed and anxious tones. This reminds me of what Lana was saying about the Ickabog. The threat of his presence and his retribution follows Jack and CP as they make their way through the various settings in the Land of the Lost in their search for DP. In the town of Bother It's Gone, which is a cute little alpine village there, the mayor, Mayor Cheese Grater, relates what happened to his predecessor. Mayor Pinkingshears was her name. She felt sorry for surplus, so she let some of it sneak off the waste to hide in our attics. The Loser got wind of what she was up to, and he ran into town, smashing apart houses. He scooped up all the surplus and ate it, and gobbled up a few things that had done nothing wrong as well. And last of all, he grabbed Pinkingshears and took her off to his lair, screaming as she went, and she's never been seen again. That's when I became mayor, and from that moment on, the law's been kept. Every sentence there has an exclamation mark, lots of intensity. Such pervasive fear encourages the things to turn against each other, so the Loser will not target them. As a result, Jack and CP have to act covertly on their mission to recover DP, helped by those things brave enough to defy the Loser. Jack and CP first encounter the Loser as they take a shortcut through the wastes of the unlamented, and this is how they first see him. So this is a kind of long quote, but bear with me because I think this is how you understand the parallels here. Two giant white searchlights were moving through the sky above the wastes. Sorry. Above the wastes, the twin beams swept the ground, illuminating the many scurrying things that were running pell-mell away from the Loser. The searchlights were his eyes, and they swung over the snowy wastes as the Loser turned his giant head this way and that. He was so tall that Jack could actually hear the top of his head scraping on the high wooden sky as his blinking eyes scanned the ground for things to eat. It was hard to tell whether he was a giant man or a robot. He didn't walk on feet, but on steel points, like a two-legged spider. His body, his arms, and his legs were all covered in millions and millions of broken things, so that he glistened all over with cogs, springs, handles, aerials, buttons, lids, and the other bits of the bodies he'd torn to pieces before eating. The Loser let out a terrible cry that shook the ground and made the boulders tremble. It was a howl of fury, but also of anguish, as though he'd lost something he loved and would never, ever get back. The Loser scoops up things with his large fingers like steel girders. And you want to notice his fingers are always outside the picture frame in all the pictures that I'll show you. He will transport those he does not immediately destroy to his lair, an underground hoarder's trove of trash and treasure, where he delights in tormenting the things he has collected before he ingests them and incorporates pieces of them into himself. To this point, several parallels between the Loser and Voldemort are apparent. Okay. Both villains are rulers, in a sense, whose reigns require the support of powerful friends. Ambition and power and ambition are embodied characters in the Christmas Pig who help the Loser. The use of bureaucracy and law to discriminate, torment, and imprison foes. The regimes also need collaborators among the relatively powerless. And so, secondly, both villains gain strength by inspiring fear remotely, a fear that has other characters facilitating an evil regime out of self-preservation. Third, this fearfulness is inspired by the power of surveillance both villains possess. Voldemort has the mind-reading power of legilimency and appears to have eyes everywhere in the wizarding world. Harry's invisibility cloak is thus enormously important, but still, Voldemort can spy on Harry through the connection that he has with Harry's scar. The loser's searchlight eyes cut through the darkness of the wastes and within his own lair. To be seen by him is to be vulnerable. Evil has the power to find and thereby to seize and to destroy. The nature of tyrannical power in both the wizarding world and the land of the lost is therefore similar and reflects a modern understanding of totalitarianism. Then, too, both villains have to create their own bodies. Voldemort from Professor Quirrell, and then the Black Sabbath in the cemetery in Book 4, in which he draws Harry's blood. The loser from bits and pieces of destroyed things. Voldemort and the loser are characterized as not only evil, but pitiless and soulless, incapable of redemption. In building their bodies from others, the two villains live by means of others' deaths. On a related point, their actions can be read as manifesting the villain's own grief and fear of death. The initial depiction of the loser describes him as someone in anguish who had, quote, lost something he loved and would never, ever get back. Voldemort, we know, grew up an orphan, having lost his mother to an early death. Although it is perhaps hard to see him as grieving, it's worth considering this might be a source for his psychopathic behavior toward his father and then in challenging death in his own specific case. Voldemort has sought eternal life in the creation of Horcruxes. Through the act of murder, he split his soul so that he could embed pieces of himself in important objects, like Ravenclaw's diadem or Slytherin's locket. Voldemort thus seeks immortality by merging with material things, as many as he can. Voldemort blurs the line between being and thing and becomes something less than fully human in his quest for eternal life. He prevents his own death by killing others, but loses his humanity in the process. In a mirror inversion, the loser similarly exists in an ambiguous state between being and thing, but he's the thing who takes on being. Instead of putting his soul into objects, he has built his robot-like body from the remains of alivened things whose life he has sucked from them. In eating them and then attaching their remains to himself, he digests life and forms a hard, sharp, external carapace that becomes the key source of his power and longevity. His hoarding is a manifestation of the idea that accumulating things is both a means to power and a way to stave off death. The Christmas Pig emphasizes an environmental message, I think, with this inversion alongside its political one. The two villains literally embody death as a means of thwarting it and coping with their fear and grief. They are purveyors of death who think that doing so will prolong their own lives. Merging thing and being in a kind of transhumanist way to extend human life becomes a reflection of their monstrousness. Note, too, that Voldemort's followers are called Death Eaters. The Horcrux Nagini literally eats Voldemort's foes, and the Dementors are creatures who suck the souls from human beings. John Donne has explained the deep religious roots of viewing death, quote, personified as a monster who eats, or swallows, like Sheol, Mott, or the Egyptian Ammon, and how such ideas appear in both Harry Potter and The Christmas Pig. Much indebted to John Donne's wonderful article on that. Represented by gaping mouths, such monsters can never be satisfied. The notions of conquering and simultaneously purveying death through consumption are mirrored in both Voldemort and the loser. And not just mouths, but I think hands, grasping hands are important. And the way that the hands were in what Louise read at the beginning for when Voldemort dies, I think that's a significant image in both. Another similarity exists in how the two villains meet their defeat. They are both foiled by a small, relatively powerless, yet courageous boy whose love outweighs his fear, along with his friends who are willing to sacrifice themselves for others. Voldemort and the loser are conquered by not only love and sacrifice, but happiness. You want to think of the Patronus charm, and most of all, hope, the latter of which are themselves embodied characters in the land of the lost. And happiness and hope, the thing with feathers, right, are helping Jack and CP, while ambition and power assist the loser. Neither villain experiences redemption. Voldemort drops lifeless like a stone at the rebounding of his killing curse. The loser presumably lives on, although his lair is emptied by a swirling golden magic that lifts the things back to the land of the living. Jack says, they're going to be recycled. They'll be made new up there and live again. Lots of alchemical imagery there. Ultimately, both Harry Potter and the Christmas Pig suggest that consumption cannot stave off death and is itself a kind of death, and that death is not necessarily an ending, but instead a new beginning. Both Voldemort and the loser reflect deep horror in the face of modern materialism and consumption. In valuing matter over spirit, Voldemort's aim to extend material existence into eternity leads to the devaluing of humanity, the source of his evil actions. The loser's hoarding and destructive urges are likewise dehumanizing. He sucks out the alivened part of things, that which they gained by being loved and which made them more than simply objects, more than the material they're made of. Placing the two villains before one another brings these ideas into focus. In terms of mirroring, so far, so good. However, there's at least one key difference worth contemplating. Voldemort is fundamentally a human being, Tom Riddle, but the loser is a constellation of things. One is organic, the other inorganic. If there's a being under all the loser's cogs and buttons, it isn't obvious who it might be, though I am going to give you some ideas in just a few minutes. Similarly, Voldemort's targets are people, and by contrast, the loser mostly targets things, except he'd really like to kill Jack. And, to have a live boy that he ingests would supposedly, I suppose, give him more being, which he is craving here. The Harry Potter novels caution against hoarding, like Creature, for example, or even Dudley Dursley with his accumulation of things. Plus, Tolanda Henderson has talked about Dudley's fatness in ways that I think kind of inform our ideas about consumption coming from the Harry Potter books particularly. Voldemort's transformation of himself into things via Horcruxes comes across as an abomination, not really life at all, and ultimately the source of his weakness and destruction. His mistake is in assuming the material world is the only world, or in fact, an eternal world. On the other hand, most of the major characters in The Christmas Pig are things, objects, possessed of the sentience toys often have in children's stories, but objects nonetheless. In The Christmas Pig, this phenomenon is explained by the notion of being alivened by a person's love. And so in the logic of the story, things can and do have value. Within the book, there is a critique of the sheer quantity of things in our modern world, especially things that are surplus or disposable, things that have no meaning for us beyond the convenience of a moment. The answer to that appears to be recycling, giving them new life, but the story also genuinely honors the love for inanimate objects we sometimes feel, seeing it as a human impulse, one that expands and extends our humanity. The author herself commented in the Q&A on her website on the special bond that forms between children and well-loved objects. So when the 2 points of view toward consumption and the material sit side by side, they encourage, I think, a nuanced reflection of where the love of things goes wrong, and when putting ourselves into things or things into ourselves can become a barrier to love for each other. Along those lines, there's another difference lurking beneath the surface of the villainous loser that demands consideration. So with Tom Riddle, the man became Lord Voldemort in the course of his perverse pursuit of eternal life. His defeat occurs when he dies ingloriously as a man. But the loser doesn't die at the end of The Christmas Pig, and when we look for the human beneath the grief and anguish and destroyed bits of things, we might find other characters. I think notably, maybe Jack, who himself raged in anguished grief at DP's loss, but also perhaps a character who was called Loser in the first part of the book, that is, Jack's bullying stepsister Holly, who was responsible for DP's destruction on the motorway. Jack calls her a loser and makes the sign of the L on his forehead because he knows it will hurt her, especially in reference to her stalled gymnastics career. But Holly is a teenager in distress from her parents' divorce, the feeling she's competing with Jack for her father's affection, and her discovery that she doesn't want to continue with gymnastics at all, thereby disappointing her mother. She is herself lost. and the intensity of those feelings drives her to fling Jack's beloved DP out the window. In the land of the lost, while they're traveling through the wastes of the unlamented, Jack and CP come across a gang called Bad Habits, one of whom is represented by a fist that has Holly's voice. Its appearance in the wastes suggests that bullying is a habit Holly is trying to lose, and it gets swept up by the loser and consumed. When the golden light of hope penetrates to the loser's lair at the end, not only the objects hoarded there are lifted up, but Jack too. The implication is that he will also be made new in the sense that he finds forgiveness for Holly, represented by the way he's extended his love to the replacement pig she gave him, CP. When she tells him she believes his tale of traversing the land of the lost and sincerely apologizes to him for what she did to DP, Jack tells her it's all right, that DP is happy in a special place called the Island of the Beloved. Quote, and I've got CP, his Christmas pig, with whom he has bonded through their shared adventures. If we think of the loser as a kind of cover for Holly, whether really or in Jack's dreaming imagination, this story does offer a chance at redemption for the human villain in Jack's life, Holly, and for himself in his forgiveness of her and his ability to let DP go. Seeing Voldemort and the loser as mirrors of villainy underscores the theme that materialism and consumption as responses to grief and fear of death lead to corruption, tyranny, and inhumanity. Instead of clinging to the material, consuming, and seeking power, both books advise that acknowledgement of loss, human connection in the face of death, and persistent, if illogical, hope provide the only true remedies to the pain of losing. The Christmas pig, however, offers redemption in the material realm through recycling instead of hoarding, and in the human realm through asking for and receiving forgiveness, both of which create renewal. Things can have value for us, and grieving their loss is an extension of our loving human natures. It's one thing to lose, and still another to be a loser. The second of the two villains reminds us particularly that we must not allow ourselves to be consumed by grief, nor take refuge in consuming matter as a means of defying human mortality. As Dumbledore says, it is our choices, Harry, that show what we truly are far more than our abilities. Voldemort never learns this lesson, but like Harry, the children in the Christmas pig do. Thanks.
All right. Thank you so much, Katie and Lana, for great presentations. This panel is everything I hoped it would be. So I know we are running a bit late because of the technical difficulties at the start, but I do want to take some time for discussion. We will make sure that the next talk gets started on time at 10:50, though. But we do have time here. So as we will be doing this entire conference, please put any questions, comments for our speakers in the chat, and I will look through them as we go, and I will put them out for answers by whichever panelist is asked. So anyway, lots of good compliments about the panel in there. Two things that really struck me. I think I mentioned that the latest Cormoran strike came out about 6 weeks ago, and I don't know how many here have read it. I'm not going to give any spoilers because my guess is many people. But both of you brought up themes that turn up in that. Lana, there is a character in the book that is absolutely a caricature of Boris Johnson. And
Right.
Trump is mentioned as well. The scene is set actually early in Trump's presidency. And he gets quite a bit of commentary in the book as well. And for Katie, the idea of attachment to things is a central theme as well. There's a very kind of amusing scene at the very end with this person who really is literally in love with this treasure. The silver treasure is on his hands and knees sobbing because he's recovered it, and Strike actually thinks he's in distress, and it's like no, he's happy. But it's this very amusing. He's got his butt sticking out of a closet, and and sobbing over this returned treasure, which definitely brings up some of the hoarding items. So here is, Beth says she's going to ask a rude question here. Okay. Now, how would you respond to the accusation that these mirrorings suggest that Rowling has few new original ideas?
So I'll launch in on that one because I had that same thought. Right? I was like, she's just recycling old stuff and but recycling being, I guess, a theme. But I actually think that you get further development, and I think you get more nuance to these ideas and to the whole Death Eater idea when you see it reflected in this world of things. And I like that she's not saying don't love things, because she's acknowledging people love things, and especially children, have their loving objects. And the story came from her real experience with her kid who had this, object that he loved. And she's like, she's not saying don't do that, right? And we can sort of see that loving things is itself not a problem all the time, but it can become a problem. And so what I like is that I think it does encourage further thinking about something, that's one way in the earlier book, but has slightly different permutation in the other book. So I see it as further development, really.
Yeah.
Beth, there is also the kind of cynical response that there aren't really a lot of new ideas, and that the achievement of authors is the way that they treat those ideas, right, in stories.
Yeah, I mean, certainly there are many, many tales of the hero's journey that Rowling wasn't the first, and she certainly won't be the last to talk about that. Yeah, what I find interesting is, yeah, I agree that we do see more nuance. I'm thinking particularly of the Ickabog. I remember a unit on fairy tales that I did in actually a German class that I took in college when I was studying German. And they were saying, one trait of a fairy tale is, black and white characters. You have good and you have evil. And we certainly don't see that in the Ickabog. You have, again, one evil character that is simply evil and unrepentant and destroyed, but you have, the king who repents. You have this false villain in the Ickabog and everything like that. So I thought that even taking that fairy tale format to turn it into that more nuanced show, if anything, I mean, there certainly is nuance in the Harry Potter. I mean, you have Sirius's black statement that the world isn't divided into good people and Death Eaters. But the major villains. I mean, the climax is really destroying the unrepentant villains with Bellatrix, and then first Bellatrix and then Voldemort. The only maybe reforming types you see is possibly some of the Malfoys, although even that is a little questionable. You don't really see it explicitly, but
Well, in the epilogue to Deathly Hallows, Draco is at least civil to Harry.
yes,
Probably an improvement. Katie, I have a question or maybe an observation for you. I was thinking when you said the phrase loser's lair, that an interesting difference among the loser and the Ickabog and Voldemort, and I'm not equating them because I do think the Ickabog is different as a kind of a false villain, but the difference is the loser has a place, he has his lair, and the Ickabog has a place, the cave, where the children find the Ickabog. And Voldemort really has no place. He's really a vagabond. He has to borrow other people's places. And that was an interesting idea for me. Do you think that's true?
It's interesting. That is interesting. And, what does he do? Like, he could have taken over his father's place, but he doesn't.
Right.
And then, of course, his bodiless state for a while, he's just a kind of floating idea. I always think of that metaphorically in terms of, that totalitarian systems can kind of
Yeah.
move around and pop up wherever. And, they don't necessarily reside in one spot. But that's such an interesting observation, Lana. I don't
Well,
know what to do with it.
we've got a
Emily
great comment from Emily in the
Yeah.
chat that says Voldemort's place is Hogwarts, but
Mm.
he thinks his place is Hogwarts, but he cannot have it. It's not only his. He would like it to be his, but
Hmm.
of course it isn't. And
I think that's true.
I
I
think
think one thing we can't argue about Voldemort is that he really does seem to love Hogwarts. I mean, despite the fact that he damages it, ultimately, it's the place that gave him his power.
Mhm. Yeah. Okay, we have another question from Dorothea for Katie. Thanks for the wonderful presentation. Just one, I wondered if the loser is also an equivalent to Dementors, with he or it feeding literally on the despairing items, beings in the wasteland and creating himself a body that is a kind of hollow and soulless on the inside, but sucks in things, feeding on their feelings, maybe their last desperate hope to be retrieved from the wasteland.
Yes, that's a great observation. Of course, I thought of that too. I think in a way, the loser brings together several villainous kinds of beings. And the Dementors certainly looms large, and that sense of um, feeding off of negative feelings, I think is a really key parallel, and the sort of soul-sucking nature. So yeah, I agree. I think it's a good comparison. And in a way, if you think about like the Dementors are beings and they have, things that they feed on, right? They have a kind of like, this is what they are as creatures. And I wonder should we think about the loser that way too? That, I mean, can he help himself? Is he evil, or is this just like his nature to feed off of things this way? But there's a delight in cruelty that he has. I'm not totally sure that I get that from the Dementors, but maybe, I don't know. But that's a great observation.
Well, I think it's interesting. Of course, the Dementors are an embodiment of clinical depression, and Rowling has been quite open about how they were inspired. So really, you can almost think of them as an illness or a disease. So I think that's why you don't have to feel guilty about destroying a Dementor. Uh, and of course, the loser shows up when Jack is processing his own grief and despair over losing this favorite toy.
Yeah, and that line about him, with describing the loser, that he lets out this howl of anguish as if he had lost something that he would never get back. Like that's Jack, Jack
Yes.
has just experienced, knowing that DP, DP gets decimated on the motorway. Like
Yes.
DP is no physical being anymore. And so that is part of the terrible tragedy there. I also liked, by the way, Emily had a comment early on. You get what's coming to you when you eat pinking shears, which I thought was kind of hilarious. But I wanted to point out that the sharp things are often the villainous ones, and the soft things are the nice ones in the universe of the Land of the Lost. So kind of
it's things do sort of take on their personality, like the earrings, the diamond earrings, of course, are very
Yes.
vain,
Right.
and so because they're objects of vanity. So there was a comment about the dual alliteration with Loser's Lair and Malfoy Manor, and things like that.
Yeah, and all the many of the character names in the Ickabog, Bert Beamish, Daisy Dovetail, Roderick Roach. I mean, lots of alliteration there.
So interesting thought from Lori Kim. Who else has difficulty reading critiques of materialism and hoarding from a billionaire? And that certainly is interesting. Of course, she was not always a billionaire, as she's always quick to point out as well. So that's certainly an interesting. And David Martin says, actually, we never see a Dementor destroyed. The only things that are destroyed are the basilisks and the boggarts. And that's a good point too. Yes, you can drive Dementors away, but it's not clear. They can breed, but it's not clear if they can be destroyed. So that's interesting.
So I really liked the way, Louise, that you divided the villains into different groups at the end. And I think together, it creates a meditation on evil and redemption. And I thought really all three of the presentations had those questions at their heart. And so I thought that was great that you pointed that out. And one of the things that I think makes the Ickabog really interesting is this malleability, that Ickabogs can be bad or they can be good, depending on their environment. And, that also, the rumors, they're not true, but they're not also totally false, right? So there's this nice ambiguity that I think comes through in the Ickabog. And that maybe that also is in terms of, questions of redemption and so on. And I like
Yeah.
the chance that Fred had, I like the idea that Fred had a chance to redeem himself and took it.
Mhm.
There's a little detail toward the end of the story that they didn't put up any monuments to King Fred, but that occasionally somebody goes and leaves flowers on his grave, and that he would have been happy to know that.
Mhm. Yeah, that was interesting. Of course, there is this false monument in the Ickabog too. They make up the story of this hero that never existed who defeated the Ickabogs and things like that, and they actually put a statue up to him. And it's interesting that in the end, instead of destroying the statue, they move it to the museum, which I think, obviously may be some commentary on some of the problematic memorials we have, particularly down here in Virginia, but also in other places as well.
Yeah, and it's a way of saying, let's remember that there was fake news, because the kingdom puts out fake news about what happened in that confrontation.
Okay. So we have a comment from Beth about Harry has no place of his own growing up, but for Harry, Hogwarts is his home until he gains the burrow in Grimmauld Place. So again, that thought that Harry gains his own place throughout the story, whereas Voldemort, of course, never really does. And all right. Well, any other questions or comments here? Anything else from our speakers?
One of the
I
things
think-
I like about these later works is that they drive me back to Harry Potter and they let me experience it sometimes with fresh eyes and a fresh, angle on analysis. And so that's one of the reasons I really liked your idea for this panel, Louise.
Yeah. So Sarah says, although Dumbledore tells Harry to call Privet Drive his home,
Oh,
and of course that is what keeps the blood protection going, is Harry thinking of that as his home. But it's clear that that is temporary, that that's going to break when he is an adult, and and of course Harry chooses to break it early. So I think that's another place, bit of place imagery that is relevant to this. Yeah, I think you're absolutely right, Katie. I mean, you do think of Harry Potter as you're reading these books, and I often wonder, what it would be like if we were reading Cormoran's Strike not knowing that Rowling was the author, which of course was her plan at the beginning.